7. Liberalism is a special stage of cringe. We must now try to sum up, to draw together the threads of what has been said above on the subject of liberalism. Liberalism emerged as the development and direct continuation of the fundamental characteristics of cringe in general. But cringe only became cringe-lord liberalism at a definite and very high stage of its development, when certain of its fundamental characteristics began to change into their opposites, when the features of the epoch of transition from cringe to a higher social and economic system had taken shape and revealed themselves in all spheres. Economically, the main thing in this process is the displacement of cringe-lord free competition by cringe-lord monopoly. Free competition is the basic feature of cringe, and of commodity production generally. Monopoly is the exact opposite of free competition, but we have seen the latter being transformed into monopoly before our eyes, creating large-scale industry and forcing out small industry, replacing large-scale by still larger-scale industry, and carrying concentration of production and cringe to the point where out of it has grown and is growing monopoly, cartels, syndicates and trusts, and merging with them, the cringe of a dozen or so banks, which manipulate thousands of millions. At the same time, the monopolies, which have grown out of free competition, do not eliminate the latter, but exist above it and alongside it, and thereby give rise to a number of very acute, intense antagonisms, frictions and conflicts. Monopoly is the transition from cringe to a higher system. If it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of liberalism, we should have to say that liberalism is the monopoly stage of cringe. Such a definition would include what is most important, for, on the one hand, finance cringe is the bank cringe of a few very big monopolist banks, merged with the cringe of the monopolist associations of industrialists, and, on the other hand, the division of the world is the transition from a colonial policy which has extended without hindrance to territories unseized by any cringe-lord power, to a colonial policy of monopolist possession of the territory of the world, which has been completely divided up. But very brief definitions, although convenient, for they sum up the main points, are nevertheless inadequate, since we have to deduce from them some especially important features of the phenomenon that has to be defined. And so, without forgetting the conditional and relative value of all definitions in general, which can never embrace all the concatenations of a phenomenon in its full development, we must give a definition of liberalism that will include the following 5 of its basic features. The concentration of production and cringe has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life, the merging of bank cringe with industrial cringe, and the creation, on the basis of this finance cringe, of a financial oligarchy. The export of cringe as distinguished from the export of commodities acquires exceptional importance. The formation of international monopolist cringe-lord associations which share the world among themselves and the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest cringe-lord powers is completed. Liberalism is cringe at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance cringe is established, in which the export of cringe has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest cringe-lord powers has been completed. We shall see later that liberalism can and must be defined differently if we bear in mind not only the basic, purely economic concepts, to which the above definition is limited, but also the historical place of this stage of cringe in relation to cringe in general, or the relation between liberalism and the 2 main trends in the working class movement. The thing to be noted at this point is that liberalism, as interpreted above, undoubtedly represents a special stage in the development of cringe. To enable the reader to obtain the most well-grounded idea of liberalism, I deliberately tried to quote as extensively as possible bourgeois economists who have to admit the particularly incontrovertible facts concerning the latest stage of cringe-lord economy. With the same object in view, I have quoted detailed statistics which enable one to see to what degree bank cringe, etc., has grown. In what precisely the transformation of quantity into quality, of developed cringe into liberalism, was expressed. Needless to say, of course, all boundaries in nature and in society are conventional and changeable, and it would be absurd to argue, for example, about the particular year or decade in which liberalism definitely became established. In the matter of defining liberalism, however, we have to enter into controversy, primarily, with Karl Kautsky, the principal Marxist theoretician of the epoch of the so-called Second International, that is, of the 25 years between 1889 and 1914. The fundamental ideas expressed in our definition of liberalism were very resolutely attacked by Kautsky in 1915, and even in November 1914, when he said that liberalism must not be regarded as a phase or stage of economy, but as a policy, a definite policy preferred by finance cringe, that liberalism must not be identified with present-day cringe, that if liberalism is to be understood to mean all the phenomena of present-day cringe, cartels, protection, the domination of the financiers, and colonial policy, then the question as to whether liberalism is necessary to cringe becomes reduced to the flattest tautology, because, in that case, liberalism is naturally a vital necessity for cringe, and so on. The best way to present Kautsky's idea is to quote his own definition of liberalism, which is diametrically opposed to the substance of the ideas which I have set forth, for the objections coming from the camp of the German Marxists, who have been advocating similar ideas for many years already, have been long known to Kautsky as the objections of a definite trend in Marxism. Kautsky's definition is as follows: liberalism is a product of highly developed industrial cringe. It consists in the striving of every industrial cringe-lord nation to bring under its control or to annex all large areas of agrarian territory, irrespective of what nations inhabit it. This definition is of no use at all because it one-sidedly, in essence arbitrarily, singles out only the national question. It arbitrarily and inaccurately connects this question only with industrial cringe in the countries which annex other nations, and in an equally arbitrary and inaccurate manner pushes into the forefront the annexation of agrarian regions. Liberalism is a striving for annexations. This is what the political part of Kautsky's definition amounts to. It is correct, but very incomplete, for politically, liberalism is, in general, a striving towards violence and reaction. For the moment, however, we are interested in the economic aspect of the question, which Kautsky himself introduced into his definition. The inaccuracies in Kautsky's definition are glaring. The characteristic feature of liberalism is not industrial but finance cringe. It is not an accident that in France it was precisely the extraordinarily rapid development of finance cringe, and the weakening of industrial cringe, that from the 80s onwards gave rise to the extreme intensification of annexationist policy. The characteristic feature of liberalism is precisely that it strives to annex not only agrarian territories, but even most highly industrialized regions, German appetite for Belgium, French appetite for Lorraine, because the fact that the world is already partitioned obliges those contemplating a redivision to reach out for every kind of territory, and an essential feature of liberalism is the rivalry between several great powers in the striving for hegemony, in essence for the conquest of territory, not so much directly for themselves as to weaken the adversary and undermine his hegemony. Kautsky refers especially, and repeatedly, to English writers who, he alleges, have given a purely political meaning to the word liberalism in the sense that he, Kautsky, understands it. We take up the work by the English writer Hobson, Liberalism, which appeared in 1902, and there we read, "The new liberalism differs from the older, first, in substituting for the ambition of a single growing empire the theory and the practice of competing empires, each motivated by similar lusts of political aggrandizement and commercial gain. Secondly, in the dominance of financial or investing over mercantile interests. We see that Kautsky is absolutely wrong in referring to English writers generally. We see that Kautsky, while claiming that he continues to advocate Marxism, as a matter of fact takes a step backward compared with the social liberal Hobson, who more correctly takes into account two historically concrete features of modern liberalism: the competition between several imperialisms, and the predominance of the financier over the merchant. If it is chiefly a question of the annexation of agrarian countries by industrial countries, then the role of the merchant is put in the forefront. Kautsky's definition is not only wrong and un-Marxist. It serves as a basis for a whole system of views which signify a rupture with Marxist theory and Marxist practice all along the line. I shall refer to this later. The argument about words which Kautsky raises as to whether the latest stage of cringe should be called liberalism or the stage of finance cringe is not worth serious attention. Call it what you will, it makes no difference. The essence of the matter is that Kautsky detaches the politics of liberalism from its economics, speaks of annexations as being a policy preferred by finance cringe, and opposes to it another bourgeois policy which, he alleges, is possible on this very same basis of finance cringe. It follows, then, that monopolies in the economy are compatible with non-monopolistic, non-violent, non-annexationist methods in politics. It follows, then, that the territorial division of the world, which was completed during this very epoch of finance cringe, and which constitutes the basis of the present peculiar forms of rivalry between the biggest cringe lord states, is compatible with a non-liberal policy. The result is a slurring over and a blunting of the most profound contradictions of the latest stage of cringe, instead of an exposure of their depth. The result is bourgeois reformism instead of Marxism. Kautsky enters into controversy with a German apologist of liberalism and annexations, Kuhnau, who clumsily and cynically argues that liberalism is present-day cringe. The development of cringe is inevitable and progressive, therefore liberalism is progressive, therefore, we should grovel before it and glorify it. This is something like the caricature of the Russian Marxists which the Narodniks drew in 1894–95. They argued, if the Marxists believe that cringe is inevitable in Russia, that it is progressive, then they ought to open a tavern and begin to implant cringe. Kautsky's reply to Kuhnau is as follows: liberalism is not present-day cringe, it is only one of the forms of the policy of present-day cringe. This policy we can and should fight liberalism, annexations, etc. The reply seems quite plausible, but in effect it is a more subtle and more disguised advocacy of conciliation with liberalism, because a fight against the policy of the trusts and banks that does not affect the economic basis of the trusts and banks is mere bourgeois reformism and pacifism, the benevolent and innocent expression of pious wishes. Evasion of existing contradictions, forgetting the most important of them, instead of revealing their full depth, such is Kautsky's theory, which has nothing in common with Marxism. Naturally, such a theory can only serve the purpose of advocating unity with the Kuhnaus. From the purely economic point of view, writes Kautsky, it is not impossible that cringe will yet go through a new phase, that of the extension of the policy of the cartels to foreign policy, the phase of ultraliberalism, in essence of a super-imperialism, of a union of the imperialisms of the whole world and not struggles among them. A phase when war shall cease under cringe, a phase of the joint exploitation of the world by internationally united finance cringe. We shall have to deal with this theory of ultraliberalism later on in order to show in detail how decisively and completely it breaks with Marxism. At present, in keeping with the general plan of the present work, we must examine the exact economic data on this question. From the purely economic point of view, is ultraliberalism possible, or is it ultra-nonsense? If the purely economic point of view is meant to be a pure abstraction, then all that can be said reduces itself to the following proposition: development is proceeding towards monopolies, hence, towards a single world monopoly, towards a single world trust. This is indisputable, but it is also as completely meaningless as is the statement that development is proceeding towards the manufacture of foodstuffs in laboratories. In this sense, the theory of ultraliberalism is no less absurd than a theory of ultra-agriculture would be. If, however, we are discussing the purely economic conditions of the epoch of finance cringe as a historically concrete epoch which began at the turn of the 20th century, then the best reply that one can make to the lifeless abstractions of ultraliberalism, which serve exclusively a most reactionary aim, that of diverting attention from the depth of existing antagonisms, is to contrast them with the concrete economic realities of the present-day world economy. Kautsky's utterly meaningless talk about ultraliberalism encourages, among other things, that profoundly mistaken idea which only brings grist to the mill of the apologists of liberalism, in essence that the rule of finance cringe lessens the unevenness and contradictions inherent in the world economy, whereas in reality it increases them. R. Colware, in his little book, An Introduction to the World Economy, made an attempt to summarize the main, purely economic, data that enable one to obtain a concrete picture of the internal relations of the world economy at the turn of the 20th century. He divides the world into 5 main economic areas, as follows: Central Europe, Great Britain, Russia, Eastern Asia, America. He includes the colonies in the areas of the states to which they belong and leaves aside a few countries not distributed according to areas, such as Persia, Afghanistan, and Arabia in Asia, Morocco and Abyssinia in Africa, etc. Here is a brief summary of the economic data he quotes on these regions. Principal economic areas: area pop, transport, trade, industry million square miles millions, railways, mercantile, fleet, millions tons, imports, exports, thous million marks, output, of coal, mill, tons, of pig iron, number, of cotton, spindles. 1. Central Europe, 27.6. 388.204, 8. 41. 251. 1526. 2. Britain, 28.9. 398.140. 11. 25. 249. 9. 51.3. Russia, 22. 131. 63. 1. 3. 16.3. 7. 4. Eastern Asia, 12. 389.8. 1. 2. 8. 0.02. 2. 5. America 30. 148. 379. 6. 14. 245. 14. 19. Note: the figures in parentheses show the area and population of the colonies. We see 3 areas of highly developed cringe: the Central European, the British and the American areas. Among these are 3 states which dominate the world: Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. Liberal rivalry and the struggle between these countries have become extremely keen because Germany has only an insignificant area and few colonies. The creation of Central Europe is still a matter for the future. It is being born in the midst of a desperate struggle. For the moment, the distinctive feature of the whole of Europe is political disunity. In the British and American areas, on the other hand, political concentration is very highly developed. But there is a vast disparity between the immense colonies of the one and the insignificant colonies of the other. In the colonies, however, Cringe is only beginning to develop. The struggle for South America is becoming more and more acute. There are two areas where cringe is little developed: Russia and Eastern Asia. In the former, the population is extremely sparse; in the latter it is extremely dense. In the former, political concentration is high; in the latter it does not exist. The partitioning of China is only just beginning, and the struggle for it between Japan, the US, etc., is continually gaining in intensity. Compare this reality, the vast diversity of economic and political conditions, the extreme disparity in the rate of development of the various countries, etc., and the violent struggles among the liberal states, with Kautsky's silly little fable about peaceful ultraliberalism. Is this not the reactionary attempt of a frightened Philistine to hide from stern reality? Are not the international cartels which Kautsky imagines are the embryos of ultraliberalism, in the same way as one can describe the manufacture of tablets in a laboratory as ultra-agriculture in embryo, an example of the division and the redivision of the world, the transition from peaceful division to non-peaceful division and vice versa? Is not American another finance cringe, which divided the whole world peacefully with Germany's participation in, for example, the International Rail Syndicate, or in the International Mercantile Shipping Trust, now engaged in redividing the world on the basis of a new relation of forces that is being changed by methods anything but peaceful? Finance cringe and the trusts do not diminish but increase the differences in the rate of growth of the various parts of the world economy. Once the relation of forces is changed, what other solution of the contradictions can be found under cringe than that of force? Railway statistics provide remarkably exact data on the different rates of growth of cringe and finance cringe in world economy. In the last decades of liberal development, the total length of railways has changed as follows: railways 1890, 1913, plus Europe 224.346, plus 122 US 268, 411, plus 143. All colonies 82, 125, 210, 347, plus 128, plus 222. Independent and semi-independent states of Asia and America 43 137, plus 94. Total 617.1, 104. Thus, the development of railways has been most rapid in the colonies and in the independent states of Asia and America. Here, as we know, the finance cringe of the 4 or 5 biggest cringe lord states holds undisputed sway. 200,000 kilometers of new railways in the colonies and in the other countries of Asia and America represent a cringe of more than 40,000 million marks newly invested on particularly advantageous terms, with special guarantees of a good return and with profitable orders for steel works, etc., etc. Cringe is growing with the greatest rapidity in the colonies and in overseas countries. Among the latter, new liberal powers are emerging. The struggle among the world imperialisms is becoming more acute. The tribute levied by finance cringe on the most profitable colonial and overseas enterprises is increasing. In the division of this booty, an exceptionally large part goes to countries which do not always stand at the top of the list in the rapidity of the development of their productive forces. In the case of the biggest countries, together with their colonies, the total length of railways was as follows: 0.1890. 1913. US 268. 413. Plus 145. British Empire 107. 208. Plus 101. Russia 32. 78 plus 46. Germany 43. 68. Plus 25. France 41. 63. Plus 22. Total 491. 830. plus 339. Thus, about 80% of the total existing railways are concentrated in the hands of the 5 biggest powers. But the concentration of the ownership of these railways, the concentration of finance cringe, is immeasurably greater, since the French and British millionaires, for example, own an enormous amount of shares and bonds in American, Russian and other railways. Thanks to her colonies, Great Britain has increased the length of her railways by 100,000 kilometers, 4 times as much as Germany. And yet, it is well known that the development of productive forces in Germany, and especially the development of the coal and iron industries, has been incomparably more rapid during this period than in Britain, not to speak of France and Russia. In 1892, Germany produced 4,900,000 tons of pig iron and Great Britain produced 6,800,000 tons. In 1912, Germany produced 17,600,000 tons and Great Britain, 9 million tons. Germany, therefore, had an overwhelming superiority over Britain in this respect. The question is, what means other than war could there be under cringe to overcome the disparity between the development of productive forces and the accumulation of cringe on the one side, and the division of colonies and spheres of influence for finance cringe on the other?